Hello and welcome to Third Culture Kids Today. This is brought to you by Relocate Global and Think Global People as part of the International Education and Schools Fair. And I'm here today with Ruth Van Reken. Ruth speaks and writes about issues related to globally mobile families. She is co-author of Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, the third edition, co-founder and past chairperson of Families in Global Transition, and currently chairperson of the governing board of Safe Passage Across Networks, SPAN. So hello, Ruth. Lovely to see you here today.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure and something I've wanted to do for quite a while. So can you tell us briefly where you grew up and how you got into the topic of Third Culture Kids, or TCKs, and globally mobile families?
Thanks. I'm glad to do that. Just to say at the beginning, TCKs is for Third Culture Kids, not Third World, but Third Culture, where people who are from one culture grow up outside their parents' culture in a different place, and in the end, we're not quite either one. We grow up in an interstitial place, a world between the two worlds that we come from and that we're living in. So for me, I grew up in Kano, Nigeria. I was born there. Both my parents were Americans. I was raised in Kano. I went back to the States when I was 13. And like so many other TCKs who thought they were from a certain place, when I got there, I found out I was probably the most ignorant person in the world. And so I adapted. I was successful, I thought, in high school and college. But finally, by the time I was 39, there was this part of me that I had this absolutely wonderful life that I loved. But there was another part that struggled with depression, and I never could understand what this thing was that didn't have language for me because it didn't make any sense. So I started journaling at 39 and trying to understand. And I realized for the first time that the very goodness of my life had kept me from looking at the losses, because I loved Nigeria. And when I left it at 13, I didn't realize my whole world died that day because, of course, by passport, it wasn't my world. And so I began to understand this story. Then I heard from Dave Pollock that there was going to be this conference and they were going to talk about reentry and so forth. And so I wrote him and I said, you're going to talk about TCKs, but you're not talking about the adult. So that was how it started. I met up with him, and he was the person who had developed the Third Culture Kid profile in his work.
So perhaps you can explain some of the biggest differences today and why TCKs are different today, do you think?
Well, what's interesting is that we're different, and yet the foundational issues remain the same. When we were growing up, mostly it was Westerners going someplace else. And that was the first cohort really that were studied. And so it was colonial days, it was post-World War II, and there's no internet. When I was 13, I came back to the States, as I said, but when I was 14, my parents went back to Africa. There was no high school for me there in the form that they thought I would need to come back and go to university. So I didn't see my parents for 4 years. I didn't talk to them because there was no phone. We didn't internet. I wrote little air forms and so forth. But I had the experience of living with my grandmother and my aunt. So that was then. Now, of course, when I've gone in last years to international schools, it's vastly different. The children are from countless countries. Many times local children are going there. And so people think, well, they're not really TCKs, but they really are living a cross-cultural experience. And we have the difference in baseline cultures that we didn't have before. You know, if kids were pretty much Western, there were, similar cultural values probably for most kids. Or if you went to an American school, they'd be American kids and so forth. But the world has changed profoundly. And so that's been some of the biggest differences. The main issues for TCKs of the past that remain are the questions of identity and the questions of loss. So the questions of identity, where am I from? become the big challenges, even while the great benefits are I got to see the whole wide world and I got to do all these wonderful things, but then where am I from? And then the questions of loss, because our losses are hidden, just as mine were. I didn't realize my world died when I left Nigeria, that with one airplane ride, I lost everything that was my life because I didn't have language for that. So those issues remain. But what's become much more complicated are the issues of language. So many people go to school now in a language that's not their home country, their home language. And so they go to school and they're in the school culture, which is often Western, but they go home to a completely different cultural world and a different language and a different expectation. And so this is part of the new discussion that's going on for schools and for the whole topic.
And that's also part of the reason why a lot of forward-thinking international schools are so keen to do a lot of different languages and offer native languages to as many children as possible.
And it's also why the issue of transition is so important and why I'm so passionate about both the research people from Families and Global Transition, but this Safe Passage Across network, and really recognized that with the mobility and for children to learn, they have to do transition well, because a lot of the research that's coming out now has to do with when kids don't feel attached and they don't feel like they belong, how that affects their learning. And that's also part of the language, and all these things are part of the educational process, not just, some fancy thought we have.
Yes, quite. So can you tell us a bit more about these increased cultural complexities that so many children and families experience? You might just explain to people what that's all about, and why this really matters, and how you can have a conversation if people are getting increasingly worried about what they say and how they say it and who they say it to.
The complexity of what's happening in today's world is mind-boggling. And if we think about this, the complexity that's in schools, the complexity that's in the corporate is huge. But the problem that I see is we're still doing a lot of diversity and inclusion by old standards. And it's more the obvious things of culture, the things that we can see. And we have to start there because that's obviously where discrimination starts, no question. But I think the next stage is, how do we hear the stories of the people, and exploring how do we look at this dynamic of the hidden cultural pieces that so many people have that are not traditionally part of the story for people that would be from this country or that. And so that's the challenge, and it's also the great opportunity.
So there must be some simple strategies or ways, I'm hoping you're going to say yes, of how you can care and work and work with cross-cultural kids and help them to grow and increase their strength and deal constructively with life changes. And that, I think, there's a lot of international schools do really well. As this is a school fair, perhaps you can sort of give us an example of the work that SPAN does in international schools that just illustrates that.
Well, I think SPAN does a great job of they've been developing transition programs, because if kids leave right and enter right, they have another chance at, a better chance of education. But I think part of what also doing this transition seminars is helping to normalize this experience. There are very clear patterns of how we respond emotionally when we're saying goodbye and saying hello. And too often we have not allowed the process to be named, or we go through it without language. So SPAN has these programs, and I've been teaching, and I've developed a great online training program for schools to help the people working in the schools to develop these programs and put them in place so that no matter which school kids go to, they could be in that same program. But I want to say also, I have seen fabulous programs in schools where the teachers, the educators, and the staff and the parents understand the process. They've studied what it is, what are the common things that kids experience when they are being raised cross-culturally, these issues of identity and belonging. And they have put in their curriculum, and they've put in their very core cells ways that children can find language for their experience, ways that kids can find out, oh, I'm not the only one that doesn't quite know where my home country is. If we tell the stories and we normalize the stories and we help children have language for the stories and for their feelings, that goes so far. And whatever we can do to help kids be seen, to know we see them, do we know we understand that the story goes on.
And I think you did mention when we were exchanging emails that you had recently been talking with a group which was in the States, and they were talking about the refugees who were coming.
Right.
And perhaps you could just share a little insight there about how there are similar experiences.
Yes. Well, if you think about children who accompany parents into another culture, certainly refugee children do. And way back when I first did this, the cross-cultural kids, somebody who worked with Darfur refugees looked at it and she said, that's the first time my people are invited back to the human race, in a sense, because we think of their issues of all being about trauma, which they certainly are. But we forget they've also lost their culture. They've lost their home. And so part of learning the story for people is the more we understand about the experience, about what is going on in the world has changed so much. And all of these things that we're learning about being cross-cultural are so important, I think, for helping us in a larger way, just not with, children who are corporate or from military or all those. But the more we understand this story, the more we understand what's going on in the globe. And I hope and believe the more help we can be to understand when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, how do we do it better?
This old term, I think, of expatriates, but people on an international assignment, or indeed anybody working for an international organisation, or as you say, is a TCC or third cultural, anybody really with that sort of background, they can be seen as very privileged, and they may feel overprivileged and are privileged. And then when they get to this location, they're a bit frozen. Well, but what can I do and how can I connect? There should surely be some way that we can encourage and build on the work and research you've done to help and encourage these international people when they're in country to be more part of that community.
One thing the pandemic has done is make us understand why transition is so vastly important, because transition isn't just about physical relocation, it's about life experience. Transition is the process we go through when there's change. So usually we would think of the change of moving the country. But in the stages of transition, you're involved, and then you have leaving, and then you have this in-between place where you're not quite sure where you are. And then you kind of land and you re-enter, and then you would think about, you're back involved again. When the pandemic happened, we all wound up in that middle stage of transition without going through goodbyes. And so it was really a confusing time for all of us because we didn't have time to prepare. And we've all experienced now why transition's so big. That many places and schools and corporations and organizations or whatever have not fully engaged or even used all the benefit of making a global experience. And part of that enormous benefit is getting to know the people in that place, getting to know the language if you can, and being involved, not just in a little bubble, but how do we live fully in that place while we're there? And it's not just a challenge, it's a wonderful opportunity that we're becoming aware of. And schools are starting to teach the local language instead of just some other one, and using more resources. So we're really at a wonderful place, I think, of awareness, and now to be building on that. And I think even SPAN is also seeing how do we apply what we've known in schools to corporations and to other places, because Every corporation, when they move people, their people are going through transition. And part of the failure is that if people can't do transition well, that's when they wind up unhappy in the next place. They never can settle because they've never really worked through how to do it well. So all of these topics that we've talked about with kids, with schools, and all that are now turning out to be completely global topics and relevant to the adults as well as the kids. And it's just incredible to me. We learned to code switch and switch cultural interactions without knowing we were doing that when we grew up in this way. We saw the world. Many kids have learned multiple languages. These gifts are many, and that's why we want to work with the challenges, because then when you can use the gifts, you see all kinds of world leaders who grew up this way, and they have a vision for what's going on, and a capacity to see beyond just something local.
And so you're hopeful for the future for children, parents, schools?
I am hopeful. We aren't going to change the trajectory we're on. We're on a global place where the world is, with transportation and moving and all that. We're only going to do it more. So what we need to do and are doing is finding ways to name it, and finding maybe even new ways to define belonging, finding new ways to learn about the whole. And I think that I have much optimism. I also know that it's important that we do it, because I've also realized that people, if they don't see the biggerness, they become afraid. And that's what you're talking about, the fear. And then the conversations become fearful and antagonistic instead of exploratory and interesting. And so maybe that's the challenge now, is to listen to each other and to try and understand. I want to know your story. It's different than my story, but I bet there's places in both our stories that we can connect. And that's where I see TCKs and CCKs. They relate in the stories, even though their experiences are vastly different. In the emotional spaces, they do relate. And I think that's where the hope comes for us all, is if we can listen to each other and learn about our stories and who we are, we can have joy then in what the differences are, because we're not afraid.
And I think that's exactly what's needed, isn't it? When there are these big conversations needed to be made about global challenges like environment and sustainability in the world, which young children and young people are so passionate about.
Well, we listen to each other in that way, we grow and we can do better. But when we get defensive and afraid, then we can't hear. And so I think that we can speak to each other with kindness and explaining who we are, and we can listen with kindness and as much understanding, and then we have conversations that take us someplace.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you today and share some of the thoughts that have led to your wonderful books and the organisations you work with. So thank you very much, Ruth Reken, for joining us today.
And thank you for inviting me, but also for the recognition you've given to FIGT and SPAN, because that means a lot.
So that was a wonderful conversation with Ruth Reken. And here are the covers of her books, Letters Never Sent and Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds, the third edition. And next to that, there is Safe Passage, which was written by Dr. Douglas Otter. So Ruth was also talking about the SPAN schools organisation, Safe Passage Across Networks, and here is information about that organisation, as well as Families in Global Transition. Here is Ruth's biography and her contact details if you would like to get involved with any of her organisations. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm the managing editor of Relocate and Relocate Global, so please do get in touch if you want to share ideas and thoughts about what we've been talking about today. Our multimedia is a free resource, so please do access on the website at relocatemagazine.com and relocateglobal.com, and our digital magazines and school and country guides. So this has been part of our autumn International Education and Schools Fair. We hope you'll enjoy the rest of the webinars in the series, and please do catch up with various webinars on transition care, which you'll find in the series. So thank you very much for joining us today.